It is a 25-pounder field gun, a heavy, iron-wheeled relic of the Second World War. By 1972, this piece of artillery was considered a museum piece by the modernized armies of Europe. It was cumbersome, manually operated, and designed for the wide-open battlefields of 1944, not the jagged, sun-scorched coastal towns of the Arabian Peninsula. Yet, in the small, dusty outpost of Mirbat in the Dhofar region of Oman, this gun was the center of an invisible gravity. To the British military establishment, the men stationed in Mirbat did not officially exist. They were not designated as combat troops. They were officially recorded as the British Army Training Team, or BATT. They wore no cap badges, no regiment patches, and carried no formal orders from London that could be traced back to the Crown. If they were killed, their bodies would be returned in plain coffins, and their families would be told they died in training accidents. They were the men of the 22nd Special Air Service, SAS. The Battle of Mirbat is perhaps the most profound demonstration of the thinking soldier doctrine ever recorded. It was a collision between two incompatible visions of the future: a Soviet-backed, communist-inspired revolutionary movement and a fading British Empire attempting to secure its final strategic interests in the Middle East through the shadows. To understand the 19th of July, 1972, one must first understand the secret war in Dhofar. By the early 1970s, the Sultanate of Oman was in the midst of a violent internal fracture. The Dhofar Rebellion, led by the PFLOAG, Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, was not a local skirmish. It was a Cold War proxy conflict. The guerrillas, known as the ALU, were trained in the Soviet Union and China. They were armed with SKS rifles, Kalashnikovs, and heavy mortars. Their objective was to overthrow the Sultan and establish a Marxist state that would control the strategic Strait of Hormuz, the jugular vein of the world's oil supply. The British response was a masterclass in grey zone warfare. They did not send divisions. They did not send the Royal Air Force for carpet bombing. They sent 9 men. If you are beginning to appreciate the tactical depth and the unvarnished reality of these shadow conflicts, please consider subscribing to the channel and enabling the notification bell. We focus on the intersection of human limits and military doctrine, providing the kind of detail-heavy analysis that respects the intelligence of the viewer. Leave a like if you value this level of research, and in the comments, I would be interested in your thoughts. In an era of massive standing armies, can a handful of individuals truly change the course of a civilization? Your engagement helps us sustain this flagship-level documentation. The 9 SAS operators in Mirbat were led by Captain Mike Kealy, a 23-year-old officer who embodied the paradoxical nature of the regiment. He was quiet, unassuming, and possessed a clinical, analytical mind that remained unaffected by the chaos of the desert. His team was a mosaic of the SAS's diverse origins. There were veterans of the Borneo jungle, experts in mountain warfare, and specialists in heart and minds operations. They had spent months in Mirbat, not just training the Sultan's irregular forces, the firqats, building clinics, digging wells, and providing veterinary care for the local livestock. The SAS understood a truth that the regular military bureaucracy often ignored. You cannot defeat an insurgency with bullets alone. You defeat it by becoming a more reliable and more permanent part of the landscape than the insurgents. But the ALU command had reached a different conclusion. They realized that the BATT teams were the only thing preventing a total collapse of the Sultan's authority in the region. They decided to strike a decisive symbolic blow. They chose Mirbat, a town of stone houses and a small fort, sitting on the edge of the Arabian Sea. The ALU plan was a masterpiece of conventional military logic applied to a guerrilla force. They massed a force of 250 to 300 highly motivated fighters. They moved through the Jebel, the rugged mountains, under the cover of the Khareef, the seasonal monsoon mist that blanketed the region in the thick grey fog. The fog neutralized the British air advantage and allowed the guerrillas to move their heavy equipment within striking distance of the town without being detected by the primitive radar or visual observation of the time. The 9 men in the BATT house were about to face a ratio of 30-1. At 5 a.m. on July 19th, the mist was so thick that the sentry at the Mirbat fort could not see more than 20 meters in front of his position. The town was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the tide against the stone walls. The first indication of the storm was the sound of a single mortar tube firing from the high ground overlooking the town. To the thinking soldier, the first shot of an ambush is not a moment for panic, but a data point. Mike Kealy, waking up in the BATT house, did not reach for a radio to call for a retreat. He reached for his boots and his weapon, already calculating the geometry of the enemy's approach. He knew the Alu would not attack from the sea. They would come from the mountains, using the fog as a shield. He also knew that his only hope of survival sat 500 meters away, near the old fort. The 25-pounder gun. In the hands of a regular artillery crew, the 25-pounder is a team-operated weapon. It requires a layer of command, a spotter, and a structured firing sequence. But in the SAS, the gun was a personal tool.
It was manned by a legendary Fijian SAS sergeant named Talaiasi Labalaba. Labalaba was a giant of a man, both physically and in the regimental lore. As the mortar rounds began to walk across the BATT house, Labalaba realized that the fort was the enemy's primary objective. If the Alu captured the 25-pounder, the 9 men in the BATT house would be systematically pounded into the earth. He did not wait for an order. He ran. He sprinted through the fog, across 500 meters of open ground, while the first waves of Alu infantry were emerging from the mist, firing their AK-47s in disciplined bursts. Labalaba reached the gunpit alone. This is the moment where the contract of the SAS is manifested. A regular soldier, alone in a pit with an obsolete cannon, facing 250 charging guerrillas, would have been justified in abandoning the position. But Labalaba began to strip the camouflage netting. He began to lug the 80-pound shells into the breach himself. He leveled the gun for direct fire, turning a long-range artillery piece into a giant, high-explosive shotgun. The first shell he fired did not just hit the enemy. It sent a shockwave through the fog that announced to the Alu that the museum piece was awake. The Battle of Mirbat was no longer a skirmish. It was a collision of will. The Alu, trained by the Soviets to believe in the inevitability of the revolution, were facing a single man who believed in the absolute necessity of the gun. As we move into part 2, we will examine the tactical mechanics of the siege, the arrival of the Strike Master jets, and the moment when Labalaba, wounded and alone, made a choice that would redefine the limits of human courage. The fog is lifting, but the air is about to get much hotter. The secret war is about to become a matter of historical record. Stay with us. The details of the 17-second clearing have nothing on the 4-hour stand of Mirbat. To operate a 25-pounder field gun correctly, a standard artillery manual dictates a crew of 6 men, 1 to lay the sights, 1 to operate the breech, 1 to load the shell, 1 to set the fuses, and 2 to manage the ammunition limber. It is a mechanical choreography of division of labor. When Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba arrived at the gun pit in the early light of Mirbat, he was a singular man attempting to replace an entire system. He had to lift the 25-pound high-explosive shells, slide them into the chamber, slam the iron breech shut, sprint to the sights to adjust for a range that was rapidly dropping from 800 meters to less than 50, and then pull the firing lever. The recoil of the gun was so violent that it threatened to crush him against the walls of the pit every time it cycled. Yet Labalaba worked with a rhythmic, clinical efficiency.
He was not shouting war cries. He was performing a calculation of survival. For the Alu guerrillas emerging from the lifting mist, the 25-pounder was a physical impossibility. Their Soviet advisors had taught them that artillery was a rear echelon asset, easily neutralized once the infantry closed the distance. They expected the gun to fall silent as they reached the outer wire of the fort. Instead, they found themselves facing a weapon that had been turned into a direct-fire sniper rifle. The Alu were not a disorganized mob. They were the PFLOAG, the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf. Their leadership consisted of men who had studied at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. They understood the dialectics of revolution. They believed that the British presence in Oman was a brittle shell of imperialism that would shatter once the first drop of blood was spilled. Their internal logic was sound. If they could seize Mirbat, they would humiliate the British SAS, prove the Sultan's weakness, and ignite a general uprising across the peninsula.
To them, Labalaba was not just a soldier. He was the final obstacle to a historical inevitability. If you are beginning to grasp the sheer physical and psychological weight of a 30-to-1 engagement, please consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze military history through the lens of institutional doctrine and individual resilience, avoiding the sensationalism of modern media to find the cold, hard truth of the battlefield. Leave a like if you value this level of objective documentation, and in the comments, I'd be curious to read your thoughts. In a situation of total tactical isolation, does a soldier fight for a cause, or simply for the man standing next to him? As the engagement intensified, the Alu focused their collective fire on the gunpit. The air around Labalaba became a chaotic soup of supersonic lead and fragmentation. A 7.62mm round struck Labalaba in the jaw. In a standard military unit, a wound of this magnitude, a shattered mandible, massive blood loss, and the sudden onset of shock, is a terminal event for the mission. The soldier becomes a casualty. The casualty becomes a burden. But the SAS selection process in the Brecon Beacons is designed to find the individual who can compartmentalize physical trauma until it becomes a secondary concern to the objective. Labalaba did not fall. He did not call for a medic. He used a piece of field dressing to tie his jaw shut, crawled back to the iron breech of the gun, and continued to load the next shell. He was soon joined by another Fijian SAS operator, Sekunaya Takavisi. Together, the two men transformed the gunpit into a fortress. While Labalaba managed the 25-pounder, Takavisi used his SLR rifle to pick off the Alu fighters who were now attempting to scale the walls of the fort. The distance between the SAS and the Alu was now so small that the 25-pounder was being fired at point-blank range. When a high-explosive shell exits the muzzle of a field gun and impacts a target 30 meters away, the result is not a tactical engagement. It is a localized atmospheric catastrophe. The concussion alone was enough to burst the eardrums of the men in the pit. The smoke from the cordite was so thick they were functionally blind, operating the weapon by touch and memory. At the BATT house, 500 meters away, Captain Mike Kealy was facing his own crisis of command. He could hear the 25-pounder firing, but he could also hear the volume of Alu fire increasing. He knew that Labalaba and Takavesi were being overwhelmed. He had a choice. He could stay in the BATT house, which offered superior cover and a secure radio link to the outside world, or he could move across 500 meters of open, fire-swept ground to reinforce the gun. To stay was logical. To move was suicidal. Kealy chose the latter. He and another operator, Tommy Tobin, began a desperate sprint toward the fort. They did not move in a straight line. They moved in the erratic, zigzag patterns of men who understood that the only thing keeping them alive was the inability of the enemy to calculate their lead.
When Kealy reached the gunpit, he found a scene that defied military description. The pit was slick with blood and hydraulic fluid. Labalaba was dead, killed by a final bullet to the head as he reached for a fresh shell. Talaiasi was severely wounded, propped up against the wheel of the gun, still firing his rifle. Tobin, the team's medic, immediately began to treat Talaiasi. In the middle of the most intense firefight of the Dhofar War, Tobin operated with the calm, steady hands of a surgeon in a London hospital. He understood that his role was not to fight, but to preserve the unit's human capital. But the Alu were now at the very edge of the pit. They were throwing grenades over the parapet. One of these grenades struck Tobin, mortally wounding him.
The thinking soldier was now down to a handful of men, a jammed cannon, and an enemy that was literally looking down into their pit. The 25-pounder had fallen silent. The Alu command believed the battle was won. They began to signal for their second wave to move in and secure the town. They did not know that Mike Kealy was now on the radio, speaking to the only asset left that could save them. High above the monsoon fog, 2 Omani Air Force Strikemaster jets were circling. These were light ground attack aircraft, flown by British pilots on contract to the Sultan. Kealy's voice on the radio was cold and precise. He did not scream for help. He gave coordinates. He gave wind speeds. He gave a target description that was so accurate it allowed the pilots to drop their ordnance within 20 meters of the SAS position. The arrival of the strikemasters was the final, decisive variable in the mathematics of Mirbat. The aircraft dived through the fog, their 20mm cannons shredding the Alu ranks, and their rockets collapsing the stone houses where the guerrillas were staging their final assault. The Alu, who had been trained for a war against men, found themselves in a war against physics. The battle had lasted 4 hours. Out of the 300 Alu who had begun the assault, nearly 80 were dead, and another 100 were wounded. The 9 SAS men had held, but the cost was carved into the dirt of the gunpit. Labalaba and Tobin were gone. Talaiasi was shattered. The 25-pounder gun stood in the middle of the carnage, its iron breech still warm, its barrel scorched by the direct fire missions. It was an obsolete weapon that had been transformed by the human spirit into a strategic tool of the First Order. As we move into the final parts of this documentary, we will examine the legacy of Mirbat, how this secret battle, hidden from the public for 30 years, became the foundational case study for modern urban warfare and counter-insurgency. We will look at how the SAS used the lessons of the Dhofar War to transition from a post-colonial reconnaissance unit into the premier counter-terrorism force of the 21st century. If you are a veteran or currently serving, I would be interested to read your thoughts on the Fijian factor in the SAS, the incredible contribution of soldiers from the Commonwealth to the history of the British Special Forces. Your insights, likes, comments, and shares ensure we can keep producing this level of flagship-level analysis. The secret war is no longer secret. The fog has fully lifted, and the truth of what happened in that gun pit is finally being told. Stay with us for part 3, where we analyze the Hearts and Minds campaign that won the war after the guns fell silent. The edge is silent, but the iron breech never forgets. It is a leather medical kit, worn at the edges and stained by the fine, red dust of the Dhofar Desert. Inside, there are no high-tech diagnostic tools or automated surgical lasers. There is morphine, sulfur powder, basic bandages, and a set of veterinary needles. To the commanders of the PFLOAG guerrillas in the mountains, this bag was more dangerous than 1,000 crates of ammunition. They called the SAS operators the men who heal the goats. While the Battle of Mirbat on the 19th of July 1972 was the ultimate kinetic expression of the SAS capability,
The war in Oman was not won in a gunpit. It was won in the clinics, at the wells, and in the marketplace. This is the hearts and minds doctrine, a phrase often mocked in modern military circles as a naive liberal fantasy. But in the hands of the 22nd SAS, it was a cold, calculated strategy of administrative warfare. The British military establishment had learned a bitter lesson in the jungles of Malaya. You cannot kill your way out of an insurgency. For every guerrilla you eliminate with a bullet, the vacuum is filled by 3 of his grieving brothers. To win, you must destroy the insurgency's reason for existence. You must make the government a better provider of the future than the revolutionaries. In Dhofar, the Alu offered the promise of a Marxist utopia, equality, land reform, and an end to the Sultan's medieval restrictions. The British offered something more immediate, survival. They established the Civil Action Teams, CATs, SAS operators, men trained to clear a room in seconds, spent their days treating eye infections in children and teaching local tribesmen how to vaccinate their livestock. This was not humanitarianism. It was competitive governance. When an SAS medic saved a tribal leader's child, he wasn't just performing a medical act. He was severing a connection between that tribe and the communist cause. He was creating a debt that could only be repaid with intelligence. If you are finding this deep dive into the dual nature of special operations, the healer and the hunter, intellectually stimulating, please take a moment to subscribe and ensure you are notified of our future releases. We explore the nuanced realities of conflict, where the most significant victories often happen away from the camera's lens. If you value this level of objective reporting, leaving a like helps the channel continue its mission. In the comments, I would be interested in your perspective. Should modern special forces be trained as much in civil engineering and medicine as they are in combat tactics? The strategic genius of the SAS campaign in Oman lay in the creation of the Fikats. The Fikats were irregular units composed of Alu defectors, men who had fought for the communists, realized the emptiness of the promise, and turned back to the Sultan. The SAS did not treat these men as prisoners. They treated them as partners. They gave them rifles, they paid them a salary, and they allowed them to fight under their own tribal leaders. This was the ultimate asymmetric weapon.
The Fikats knew the terrain better than any British soldier. They knew which cave held a weapons cache and which village elder was leaning toward the revolution. Most importantly, they represented the failure of the communist ideology. When a former revolutionary stands in a village square, armed and paid by the government, the revolution's narrative of inevitable victory begins to dissolve. However, this heart and minds strategy required a foundation of absolute security. The local population would only support the Sultan if they were certain the Alu could not return and execute them for treason. This is why the Battle of Mirbat was the hinge of the entire war. If the 9 SAS men had failed, if the 25-pounder gun had been captured and the town leveled, the message to the people of Dhofar would have been clear. The British cannot protect you. The Sultan is a ghost. The revolution is the only reality. The Alu command understood this perfectly. Their assault on Mirbat was their Tet offensive. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble to prove that the British secret war was a lie. When the 9 men held, when the Alu retreated into the mountains with their leadership decimated and their morale shattered, the political gravity of the region shifted permanently. The secret war remained secret for a reason. In 1972, the British government was facing intense domestic pressure. The memory of the Suez Crisis was still fresh. The public was weary of imperial adventures. If the British people had known that their most elite soldiers were fighting a high-intensity war in the Middle East to protect an absolute monarch,
the political blowback would have been catastrophic. For 30 years, the survivors of Mirbat were forbidden from speaking about that morning. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba was awarded a posthumous mention in dispatches, a minor decoration that completely obscured the scale of his sacrifice.
Captain Mike Kealy received the Distinguished Service Order in private. There were no parades, there were no news segments. The SAS operated in a state of institutional humility. They understood that their effectiveness was tied to their invisibility. In the grey zone, credit is a liability. The transformation of the SAS following Oman was profound. They had proved that they could run a theatre of war with a handful of operators. They had proved that the thinking soldier, a man who could navigate the complexities of tribal politics while maintaining the lethality of a Tier 1 asset, was the future of warfare. The lessons of the Dhofar War were codified into the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare (CRW) wing of the SAS. They began to study urban environments, hostage rescue, and the psychology of the modern insurgent. The secret war in the desert had provided the blueprint for the 1980 Iranian Embassy Siege and the subsequent operations in Northern Ireland. The 25-pounder gun in the Mirbat fort was eventually replaced by a museum piece, but the philosophy of the gun remained. It is the philosophy of the maximum effect with minimum force. It is the idea that the right man in the right place with the right level of discipline can negate the power of an army. But as the 1970s progressed, the SAS began to face a new kind of enemy. The communist guerrillas of the desert were being replaced by the urban terrorists of the European capitals. The secret war was coming home, and the men who had healed goats and manned field guns in Oman were about to find themselves on the front lines of a global conflict that would define the next 50 years. In Part 4, we will look at the immediate tactical evolution of the SAS after Mirbat, the creation of the Special Projects Teams, and the secret training of the world's elite counter-terrorism units. We will analyze how the silence of the desert became the silence of the black balaclava. The edge is still silent, but the world is starting to notice the shadow. Stay with us. The most classified chapters of the SAS history are about to be opened. It is a hood made of black Nomex, a flame-resistant meta-aramid material designed to withstand temperatures of up to 370 degrees Celsius. It possesses two roughly cut apertures for the eyes and a single opening for the mouth. It is lightweight, breathable, and entirely devoid of any insignia, rank, or identifying markers. To the average citizen watching the evening news in 1980, this black balaclava was a symbol of terrifying anonymous violence. But to the inner circle of the British Special Air Service, it was the final seal of the thinking soldier. It was the physical manifestation of the transition from the secret war of the desert into the surgical war of the modern metropolis. The Battle of Mirbat in 1972 had proven that 9 men could hold a town against an army. It had validated the doctrine of extreme autonomy and the maximum effect with minimum force. But the geopolitical landscape was shifting. The threat was no longer just communist guerrillas in the mountains of Dhofar. It was the rise of international terrorism. Highly motivated, media-savvy cells that brought the front line into the heart of Western capitals. The SAS realized that the skills honed in the desert, the tracking, the endurance, the hearts and minds clinics, needed to be supplemented by a new, hyper-specialized capability. They needed to master the art of the close quarter battle, CQB. In the mid-1970s, the regiment established the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare, CRW, wing. Its purpose was to develop the tactics, weapons, and equipment required to resolve hostage situations with a level of precision that had never before been seen in military history. This was the birth of the Special Projects, SP, team. The SP team was not a standing unit.
It was a rotating duty,
where a single squadron would be designated as the counter-terrorist CT team for a 6-month period. They lived in a state of permanent, high readiness at Stirling Lines in Hereford. Their training was an exercise in absolute, uncompromising repetition. They built the Killing House, a multi-room structure with reconfigurable walls and live fire capacity. Here, the thinking soldier became a machine of reflexive motor patterns. They practiced room entries thousands of times. They learned to identify a hostile target and deliver 2 rounds to the A zone, the center of the head or chest, in less than half a second. They learned to fire while wearing gas masks, while rappelling down walls, and while moving through clouds of CS gas and flashbang disorientation. The philosophy was a direct evolution of the 25-pounder gun at Mirbat. In the desert, Sergeant Labalaba had used a field gun as a sniper rifle. In the Killing House, the SAS used the individual soldier as a surgical instrument. If you are beginning to understand how the hard-won lessons of the Arabian desert were distilled into the most lethal counter-terrorism doctrine in the world, please take a moment to subscribe and ensure your notifications are active. We analyze these transitions with a cold, objective lens, focusing on the institutional evolution that occurs when a unit is forced to adapt to a changing threat. Leaving a like helps us maintain the quality of these flagship documentaries. In the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. Can a soldier trained for the absolute violence of the battlefield ever truly adapt to the restrained violence required in a civilian hostage situation? The ultimate test of the CRW doctrine came on the 30th of April 1980. 6 armed gunmen, members of the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan, stormed the Iranian Embassy in Prince's Gate, London.
They took 26 hostages, including a British police officer and members of the BBC. Their demands were political: the release of prisoners in Iran and the autonomy of their home province. To the Metropolitan Police, it was a hostage crisis. To the British government, led by Margaret Thatcher, it was a challenge to the sovereign authority of the state. To the SAS, it was a special project. For 6 days, the SASSP team sat in a building adjacent to the embassy. They were the ghosts of Prince's Gate. They used microphones pressed against the walls to track the movement of the terrorists. They used fiber optic cameras dropped through the chimneys to map the interior. They lived in a state of suspended animation, their black Nomex suits on, their weapons checked, waiting for the one word that would launch the machine. This was the sissy-like patience of the modern era. Just as the Finnish scouts had sat in the snow for 3 days without moving, the men of B Squadron sat in the darkness of a London terrace house, watching the clock. The order came at 19:23 on May 5th, after the terrorists executed a hostage and dumped his body on the front steps. The mission was designated Operation Nimrod. The world watched in real time as the black-clad figures appeared on the balconies. This was the first time the public had seen the SAS in action since the Second World War. To the viewers, it looked like a chaotic, explosive assault. To the thinking soldier inside the building, it was a high-speed execution of a pre-planned program. They did not run into the building blindly. They used explosive frame charges to blow the windows. They used rappelling ropes to enter from the roof. They used the HK-MP5, a submachine gun that would become synonymous with the unit, firing in disciplined 3-round bursts. The assault lasted exactly 11 minutes. Inside the smoke and the fire of the embassy, the SAS operators moved with a speed that the terrorists could not process. In the telex room, where the majority of the hostages were held, the terrorists attempted to execute their captives. An SAS operator coming through the door identified the gunman with the weapon raised.
He delivered a burst that was so precise it neutralized the threat before the terrorist could pull the trigger. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. 1 was captured, hidden among the hostages. Every remaining hostage was rescued. The 11 minutes of perfection at the Iranian Embassy did more than save 26 lives. It fundamentally altered the global perception of special operations. It proved that the SAS could operate in the most high-stakes, media-saturated environment on Earth and achieve a result that was mathematically precise. But the black balaclava was also a mask of erasure. Following Operation Nimrod, the SAS were the most famous soldiers in the world, yet their faces remained unknown. They returned to Hereford, cleaned their weapons, and prepared for the next rotation. The institutional humility remained. They understood that the fame was a liability. The more the world knew about their tactics, the more the next enemy would adapt. The transition from Mirbat to London was now complete. The secret war had evolved into the professional shadow. The SAS had become the gold standard for every counter-terrorism unit in the world, from the American Delta Force to the German GSG-9. They all came to Hereford to study the killing house, the black Nomex suits, and the thinking soldier philosophy. But as the 1980s progressed, the thinking soldier would find himself facing a different kind of challenge. The front line was shifting again, this time to the cold, rain-swept streets of Northern Ireland. The enemy was no longer an embattled terrorist cell in an embassy. It was a deeply embedded, highly sophisticated urban insurgency that would test the SAS's hearts and minds doctrine to its absolute limit. In the final part of this series, we will examine the War of the Shadows in Northern Ireland, the surveillance, the ambushes, and the moral grey zones that define the regiment's most controversial chapter. We will return to our original question. What is the cost of being the silent edge for a nation that officially denies your existence? The balaclava is fire-resistant, but it cannot protect a man from the weight of his own secrets. Stay with us for the conclusion. The most interesting part, the ultimate legacy of the SAS, is at the very end. It is a monument of cold, grey granite, standing in the quiet grounds of the SAS headquarters in Hereford. On its surface are inscribed hundreds of names, many of which are unknown to the public. There are no descriptions of rank, no citations of specific battles, and no poetic tributes to the cause for which they died. There is only a date and a name. Beside this wall stands a life-sized bronze statue of a man, stripped to the waist, leaning over the sights of an invisible field gun. It is Talaiasi Labalaba. To the residents of Hereford, this is a local memorial. To the British state, it is a discreet acknowledgement of a strategic necessity. But to the men of the 22nd SAS, this statue is the final resolution of the contract. It is the physical proof that while the state may deny your existence and the bureaucracy may erase your history, the regiment remembers the individual. The 25-pounder gun at Mirbat was a museum piece, an obsolete machine of a dying empire. But it was the man behind it who transformed it into a force that changed the history of the Middle East. The legacy of the secret war in Dhofar and the 11 minutes at Prince's Gate did not end with the retirement of the men who fought there. It was absorbed into the institutional DNA of the British Special Operations community, creating a blueprint for warfare that would be tested in the most demanding environments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In the 1980s and 90s, the thinking soldier doctrine faced its longest and most psychologically taxing challenge, Northern Ireland. This was the graduate school of special operations. Unlike the desert of Oman or the embassy in London, Northern Ireland was a war of the shadows, fought among the unit's own citizens. The enemy was the Provisional IRA, a sophisticated, deeply embedded, and highly intelligent urban insurgency. The IRA did not move in columns or occupy forts. They lived in the terraced houses of Belfast and Derry. They used the legal system as a shield,
and the media as a megaphone. The SAS response was a return to the principles of Mirbat, extreme autonomy and surgical intelligence. They operated in small surveillance teams, often living in crawl spaces and derelict buildings for weeks, watching the movement of IRA active service units. This was the era of the 14 Intelligence Company and the DET, specialized surveillance units that worked alongside the SAS to map the human geography of the insurgency. The most controversial and tactically perfect expression of this doctrine was the Lofgol ambush of 1987. An IRA unit, using a mechanical digger to carry a massive bomb, attacked a police station. They expected a standard response. Instead, they found 24 SAS operators waiting in concealed positions. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The IRA unit was neutralized in its entirety. Lofgol was the modern version of the 25-pounder direct fire mission. It was the application of absolute violence at the exact point of tactical decision. But it also highlighted the moral gray zone of the SAS mission. The state was using its most lethal soldiers to perform a task that the police and the conventional army could not. The secret war was being fought in the heart of the United Kingdom, and the price of that war was a legacy of secrecy and controversy that shadows the regiment to this day.
If you are beginning to understand the profound, often hidden impact that a small group of highly trained individuals can have on the course of global events, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We aim to respect the intelligence of our audience by providing a clinical, unvarnished analysis of military history, moving beyond the sensationalism of the evening news. In the comments, I would be interested in your final assessment of this series. In the 21st century, is the thinking soldier a model for all modern armies, or is the SAS an anomaly that cannot be replicated? Your engagement helps us continue to produce this level of flagship-level documentation. As the 21st century dawned, the SAS found itself at the forefront of a globalized, industrialized form of special operations. The global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan saw the secret war model expanded to an unprecedented scale. In Baghdad, under the designation Task Force Black, the SAS operated within a massive, high-speed targeting machine. They were conducting raids almost every night, using the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, F3EA cycle. This was a war of industrial intelligence. A raid at midnight would produce a mobile phone. The phone would be cracked by 2 a.m., revealing the next target, and the next raid would launch by 4 a.m. The SAS operators of Task Force Black were the direct descendants of the men at Mirbat. They still relied on the thinking soldier philosophy, but they were now integrated into the most advanced intelligence architecture in human history. Yet, despite the drones, the satellites, and the biometric scanners, the final outcome of the mission still depended on the 4 men at the door and the 17-second room clearance. But it is in the current era, the era of persistent engagement, that we see the true fulfillment of the Dhofar strategy. The British military has recently established the Special Operations Brigade and the Ranger Regiment. These units are specifically designed to perform the Hearts and Minds and British Army Training Team roles that the SAS pioneered in Oman. They are sent to the world's grey zones to train partners, build clinics, and stabilize regions before they descend into full-scale conflict. The SAS has returned to its Tier 1 role, the silent edge that only appears when all other options have failed. They have moved back into the shadows, focusing on high-end counter-terrorism, clandestine reconnaissance, and the neutralization of state-level threats. They remain the insurance policy of the British state, a force that officially does not exist, but whose presence is felt in the silence of the enemy's command centers. The final chapter of our analysis returns to the man who led the 9 at Mirbat, Kealy. Kealy's life and death provide the ultimate philosophical conclusion to the SAS story. After the Dhofar War, Kealy remained in the regiment. He did not seek a political career or a life of public fame. In 1979, during a routine SAS training exercise in the Brecon Beacons, the same mountains where selection is held, Kealy was caught in a sudden, brutal blizzard. The man who had survived the 30-to-1 odds of Mirbat, the man who had outthought the Soviet-backed revolutionaries in the desert, died of hypothermia on a Welsh hillside. He died because he refused to stop. He died because he pushed himself to the same standard he demanded of his men. This is the cold reality of the thinking soldier. The system that produces the individual who can change history is the same system that eventually consumes him. The standards of the SAS are absolute, and they do not make exceptions for heroes. The 25-pounder gun at Mirbat is now a silent relic of a forgotten war. The Nomex balaclava of the Iranian Embassy is an iconic image of a previous era. But the individual beneath the mask remains the center of gravity in the modern world.
The SAS has proved that you can spend billions of dollars on technology. You can fly drones over every valley, and you can encrypt every communication. But you cannot replace the judgment of a supremely trained human being at the point of decision. You cannot replace the Fijian factor of a Sergeant Labalaba. You cannot replace the clinical calm of a Mike Kealy. As the geopolitical fog of the 21st century thickens, with the rise of peer-to-peer conflict and the return of state-level competition, the secret war model is more relevant than ever. The world is moving back into the grey zone, where the front lines are invisible and the targets are anonymous. The British state will continue to deny the existence of its most effective assets. The names will continue to be added to the granite wall in Hereford, and the men will continue to sit in the dark, taping their gear, checking their weapons, and waiting for the one word that launches the machine. They are the men who healed the goats, and the men who cleared the rooms. They are the doctors, the engineers, the snipers, and the ghosts. They are the living manifestation of the idea that quality defeats quantity, and that intelligence defeats mass. The Silent Edge is not just a military unit, it is a philosophy of existence. It is the realization that in a world of machines, the ultimate weapon is still the human mind. Thank you for watching this hour-long flagship documentary on the evolution of the SAS. It has been a journey through the desert, the metropolis, and the shadows of the 20th century. If this analysis has respected your intelligence and provided a new lens through which to view military history, please ensure you are subscribed. Your support allows us to maintain this level of rigorous, objective storytelling. The 25-pounder gun is silent. The balaclava is folded. The contract is signed in blood and fulfilled in silence. Stay objective. Stay resilient. Who dares wins. The edge is silent, but its history is written in the survival of a nation. This is the end of the secret war. But in Hereford, the 25-pounder is always ready. Goodbye.